to express my gratitude for the opportunity to share with you tonight. And I'm going to just go now. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see. So tonight, we are looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew. And it's an introduction that I am doing. So in a very real sense, I am the John the Baptist, or someone who will come after me on Sunday. And he is much greater than I am. So I'm simply just doing the introduction to the Gospel of St. Matthew. These days I find myself on several occasions having to go before Pastor David. So I'm really his forerunner tonight. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with a general introduction to the gospel. So Matthew's gospel has long been regarded as the most popular of the four canonical gospels, the four gospels in our canon. Our New Testament canon. And it was certainly widely used in the early Christian communities. It was widely used in the early church. In fact, for some time, it was thought to be the first gospel written, though now scholars believe Mark really was written first. And truth is, many people are familiar with Matthew's gospel, as it contains some of Jesus' most famous teachings, teaching like love your enemies, turning the other cheek, do not be anxious about tomorrow, suffer the little children to come unto me, go make disciples of all nations, and the Lord's Prayer, in the form that most churches use today, as opposed to Luke's version. So Matthew has been popular, has been very, very popular. Who actually wrote the book of Matthew, though? We know the book bears his name, but who actually did the writing? And I think by now we know that not all the books who bear the name of someone was actually written by them. So it's more, it's not so much the book of, for example, Ruth, that Ruth wrote the book, as it is more about Ruth. So the book of Matthew, who wrote it? Now, according to tradition, this gospel was actually written by Matthew, also called Levi, and he's identified as a former tax collector and one of Jesus's 12 disciples. Now, since the times of the early church fathers, Matthew, former tax collector, disciple of Jesus, has always been accredited with the authorship of this first gospel. As far as our New Testament canon is concerned, Matthew is the first gospel. That's when it says canonically. That's basically what it means. The first gospel in the canon, the New Testament canon that we hold. So the title, according to Matthew, in the Greek, is actually found in the earliest manuscripts and was the most highly regarded and quoted of the Gospels by the early church fathers. Interesting. The text itself seems to suggest and implies that the author was clearly an early Jewish Christian who was well educated and seemingly multilingual, because there are aspects of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek in his original text. And it is clear that he was also an interpreter of earlier traditions, adopting and adapting several sources in the telling of his tale. And we draw that also from the fact that he also recorded events at which he was not present. So he had to have had sources, because he wasn't there when the angel came to Mary, but he wrote about it. So obviously, he had sources. And so it is commonly believed that certainly it was that Matthew. Now, a little bit more problematic is the date of writing. When was this gospel written? The date of Matthew's gospel is far from certain. Various estimates have placed the date of Matthew's gospel anywhere from AD 50 to AD 100. And in fact, there are some scholars who believe that the book was written even later than AD 100. Now, it is clear that Matthew drew from Mark. And it is commonly held that Mark, as I mentioned before, was the first gospel. Now, if Mark was written first, then Matthew naturally had to have been written after Mark. And the most widely accepted hypothesis is that both Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source text. In fact, Matthew reproduced about 90% of Mark's gospel, while Luke reproduced about 60%. And some believe that Mark was probably written somewhere between AD 50 and AD 55. Now, if the above is accurate, then Matthew's gospel could reasonably have been written anywhere between AD 55 and AD 60. Now, bear in mind, this is not gospel, and a pun definitely intended. These are scholars now who are trying to place Matthew's gospel along a timeline. And so the dates can be fluid depending on who the scholar is. Now, this date, say Matthew's gospel being written between AD 55 and 60, allows time for Matthew to have access to Mark's gospel, to read it, to understand it, and suggests that he completed his gospel. If he wrote it between AD 55 and into the AD 60s, then it would suggest that he completed the gospel before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Because it certainly would seem strange, the odd scholars contend, for the author not to mention this event in light of chapter 24 when he talks about the destruction of the temple. So the contention is, if the temple was destroyed in AD 70, Matthew seemingly makes no reference to that, then his gospel would have had to be written before the actual destruction of the temple. And all this suffering that is indicated here in Matthew chapter 24. So that's one argument there. And this dating, the 55 to the 60s, would also allow time for Luke to use Matthew's gospel in composing his own gospel, as well as its sequel acts. So the thinking there is that if Matthew was written between the mid-50s and into the 60s, then certainly it would be consistent with him using Mark's gospel because it came before. And also it would be consistent with Luke using Mark and Matthew's gospels as source texts for his gospel if he wrote in the 60s, before the destruction of the temple. So those are some of the arguments there. But it continues. Now, having said all of that, here's another argument. If the Gospel of Matthew was written after AD 70, just suppose it was written then, as some scholars contend, why does Matthew minimize the destruction of the Jerusalem and the temple? For example, in Matthew 22:7, Matthew records, the king was enraged and sent his troops, destroyed those murderers and burnt their city. That seemed like an understatement to describe such a huge and terrible event. You remember that passage where this man had this vineyard and he sent these people to collect rent and they wouldn't pay, and then he finally sent his son and they murdered his son. And that is contended by some to be in some way depicting the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so the argument then is, if that is so, if he wrote after AD 70, why does Matthew not seemingly talk about such a, what would have seemed a cataclysmic event, the rebellion of the Jews against the Roman and called the Jewish War, and the ultimate destruction of the temple and the raising of Jerusalem? Now here's a response. If Matthew was written, location, now we're talking about, not time so much. If Matthew was written in Antioch or another location that was well away from the war zone, which means it was well away from Jerusalem, from Palestine, then it is contended we can understand his lack of specific focus on the Jewish war and the destruction of Jerusalem. He wasn't there. If Matthew wrote well away from the war zone and was not directly involved in it, then it is contended that a post-AD 70 dating is consistent with his lack of information about the Jewish war. And that sounds reasonable. If he wasn't there, he could hardly have been writing very much about it, because whatever he was writing would have to be second or third hand, but he certainly wasn't there to witness it. So today, there's a seemingly kind of perhaps consensus that among scholars that the date for the actual writing of Matthew's gospel was somewhere between the 80s or the 90s AD, certainly within about 25 years of the destruction of Jerusalem. But it might well be the case that the evangelist Matthew wrote his work even some decades after this, meaning into the second century, the early second century. The bottom line is, we do not know exactly when Matthew's gospel was written. We know it was early, but how early, we do not know. So, I'm sorry I can't give you a definitive word on that. But that's the reality. We really do not know the exact time when Matthew wrote. But it seemingly, it could be anywhere from the mid-first century into the early second century. Now, here's another question. From where was Matthew written? Where was Matthew when he was writing his account? Now, it's not, though dating the gospel may be difficult or complicated, it is even more problematic, more complicated to determine where Matthew was when he wrote the gospel. So not only are we not sure about when he wrote it, we are certainly not very sure about where he was when he wrote it. There's still a question mark even on what language Matthew was originally written in, which can vary the location greatly, because it would seem to reflect where he was when the language that he used would certainly seem to have would reflect where he was when he was writing it. This can take the location all around the upper Middle East into Israel, Syria, and even Iraq, or present Iraq. But since Matthew is described as the most Jewish gospel, and I'll explain that later on, this means that it was probably written in an area with a lot of Jews or Jewish believers. The area most likely would be the Holy Land, which is now Israel and Palestine. But there is strong support for Antioch in Lower Turkey, since there is also a lot of support for the gospel being written in Aramaic then. So there is uncertainty. Most scholars conclude that Matthew was written either in Palestine or Syria because of its Jewish nature. Antioch of Syria. As you know, there were two Antiochs. There was Pisidian Antioch and Syrian Antioch. So Antioch of Syria is usually the most favored because many of the early church, in fleeing from Jerusalem, actually went to reside in Antioch in Syria. Now, another reason for favoring Antioch in Syria is that the earliest reference to Matthew's gospel was found in Bishop Ignatius of Antioch in his epistle to the Smyrnians, and that was in around AD 110. So what happens now is that there seems to be some way that Matthew's gospel was perhaps written in Smyrna, in Antioch, in Syria, because of Bishop Ignatius, who was one of the early church fathers. And so that gives us a clue as to perhaps where it was written. So here is a map, and number one, let me see if you can, no, you can't. Yes, you can see my cursor. I'll move it as slowly as possible. So it was either there in Israel or there in the lower part of Turkey, just almost on the border in Syria there. And
Brother Courtney, somebody has raised their hand. I think they may want to ask a question. That's Kay Bailey.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Uncle Brandon. I was saying then, if Bishop Ignatius wrote about Matthew in 110, that means that Matthew would have been written earlier than the 2nd century.
Yes, would have been written earlier, yes.
Right.
Yes.
And also my other point was, if Matthew was companion to Jesus, so he would have been pretty old.
Beg your pardon?
He would have been very old to be writing then in the year 100, year after. He would have been nearly 100 or more.
He would have been a very old man. He would have been a very old man, yes. Yes. But there are some persons who did live to be quite old too. But
Yes, but, you know, given the nature and the urgency of the situation, I would have thought he wouldn't wait until he was 100 to write. And then that would also push out the dates for Luke. If he wrote that old.
So maybe all of these things that you're pointing out would perhaps lead some of the scholars to say probably he wrote, you know, after Jerusalem's fall in AD 70. So it could have been, that's why the timeline is pretty wide. And basically what you're saying is that it's probably not going into the 2nd century. It would probably be written in the 1st century, the latter half of the 1st century. I think that's what I figure you're suggesting, Kate.
Or even earlier, because if Luke was written in AD 62 and 82.
That's one argument. That's one argument.
Yeah, you know, I wonder if he used Matthew.
And it's that book did use Matthew and Mark.
And Mark.
Yes.
So it would have been, then Luke would have been written after.
Yes, it would have, yes, it's considered so. Yeah. But you understand. So now you understand some of the challenges that the scholars come up with in trying to date books.
Yes.
Really looking at things that are not specifically relative to date, but trying to look at some facts and then theorize and then say, well, if that happened, then perhaps that was that, and therefore. So it's not a precise science, especially when you have no markers.
May I suggest something here, Brother Courtney? In terms of the tone of Matthew's writing, he does not write as someone reflecting as John does. There's clear evidence that John would have been written much later and writes with more of a reflective tone. Matthew's writing carries the kind of immediate staccato type thing like Mark and like Luke. And it certainly reflects someone's passion for something he witnessed in the now or recently, as opposed to something he was reflecting on. And with his Jewish emphasis, I tend to believe whether he was in Turkey or whether he was in Palestine, he would have come across Jews that would have been affected by the destruction of the temple in 70, which was really a massive thing, that with the scattering of Jews and men who further scattered and so on. And so I do share the view of an early writing, meaning pre-70. And I know the question that some might want to ask, why is that important in terms of the dating of Matthew? I don't know if you're taking questions now or you want to take questions later, but finish your presentation. But I think it's an important question for us to consider. Why is dating important?
And I think
I'm going to suggest that we allow Brother Courtney to complete his presentation and that we take questions at the end rather than
That's fine.
in between. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
We've taken one important question from Sister Kay, but let's hold our other questions until he has finished the presentation.
Thank you.
So please proceed, Courtney.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Now, okay, we have alluded to this and a bit earlier, but for whom was Matthew written? Who was the audience? Now, it seems obvious and widely accepted that Matthew was written to a Jewish audience. And here are some facts that tend to give assent to this. One, he focuses on the fulfillment of the Old Testament, even quoted from it 62 times, which is more than any other gospel writer. Matthew does not explain Jewish culture like the other evangelists like Mark and John, which also adds to the argument that he's writing to Jews. So you remember in that account in John chapter 4, when Jesus is having this encounter with this woman at the well in Samaria. And Jesus asks the woman for a drink. And the woman is taken aback because she recognizes that he's a Jew. And then John explains that the Jews had no real relation at all with the Samaritans. Matthew does not explain any aspect of Jewish culture like the others, because he was writing to a Jewish audience who would have understood it anyway. Matthew uses the phrase kingdom of heaven. In fact, he's the only author to use this phrase, which can be considered as a reverential Jewish expression, a term appropriate to a Jewish audience. His purpose in writing to the Jews was to show them that Jesus of Nazareth was the expected Messiah, and both his genealogy and his resurrection were legitimate proofs of this. So Matthew is the one who is able to go into the Old Testament and point out that the expected Messiah, the prophesied Messiah, through his genealogy, through his death and his resurrection, is the Son of God, the promised anointed Son of God. He also cites the Hebrew scriptures and refers to Old Testament figures often usually in order to demonstrate Jesus fulfills Jewish prophecy. At the birth narrative, Matthew describes Joseph taking Jesus and Mary to Egypt and back to Nazareth, and quotes Hosea 11, verse 1. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt, I have called my son. I have called my son. Typo there with the 3. He quotes Matthew 3, verse 3, quoting Isaiah 40, verse 3. Matthew 4, quoting Deuteronomy, and several times throughout his gospel. So by one count, Matthew includes 61 quotations from the Old Testament, compared to 31 in Mark, 26 in Luke, and 16 in John. So from all accounts, Matthew was thoroughly acquainted with Jewish culture, Jewish history, and Jewish scriptures. It is thought that Matthew's intended audience was probably a relatively well-to-do city church, made up mostly of educated Jews who already believed Jesus was the Messiah, but who disagreed amongst themselves about the import of the law. So one of the things that it's thought that Matthew was doing was trying to show that, listen, you know the law, Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Now, the structure of the Gospel of Matthew. It is considered Matthew is the most clearly organized of the 4 canonical Gospels. And it's considered that Matthew adheres fairly closely to the structural outline of his source, the Gospel of Mark, although he clearly found Mark's beginning and ending to be insufficient, since he added the infancy narrative and post-resurrection scenes to his version of the story. Now, alternating between blocks of narrative and blocks of discourse, blocks of narrative storytelling and blocks of discourse teaching, Matthew's gospel is considered to be built around 5 major speeches of Jesus, each of which concern the kingdom of heaven. So we see there 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount, which speaks about the ethics of the kingdom. How do we act? How do we act as citizens of the kingdom? Chapter 10, the commissioning of the 12, which is the mission of the kingdom. Chapter 13, the parables, the nature of the kingdom. 18, community instruction, the governance of the kingdom. And the Olivet Discourse in chapters 23 to 25, the future of the kingdom. Each of these sections, it is observed, ends with a similar formulation. Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, and in this case, in chapter 7, the crowd were astounded at his teaching. I don't know why these numbers keep coming out. The typo is my fault. I apologize to you. There should be no 4 there. In chapter 11, now when Jesus had finished teaching his 12 disciples, he went on. Chapter 13, when Jesus had finished these parables, you notice, now when Jesus had finished saying, when Jesus had finished teaching, when Jesus had finished these parables, when Jesus had finished saying these things, chapter 19, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, chapter 26. So it's clearly deliberate what Matthew was doing here. Clearly deliberate. It lends to the structure. It wasn't just a hodgepodge, oh, I remember this, I remember that. No. He was putting structure and order to what he was writing. The overarching geographical progression of the narrative depicts Jesus moving from his homeland in Galilee to his rejection in Jerusalem and triumphantly back to Galilee at the end. So there's also a kind of geographical movement as well, as far as how Mark has arranged, or Matthew rather has arranged the book. But I also find interesting that there are some distinctive features in this gospel. Matthew vilifies, famously, infamously vilifies the leaders of the Jewish people, particularly the Pharisees. Now, it is important for us to remember that for Jews, the Pharisees are positive, not negative. They sought faithful adherence to God's law and offered sophisticated, learned interpretation of the Torah, the 5 books. Many of the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, many consider them to be the spiritual fathers of modern Judaism. So when you read Matthew's account, oh, Jesus gives the Pharisees a hard time. But this is not how they were considered. They were highly revered, highly respected. In Matthew, however, they are Jesus' opposition. He condemns their hypocrisy and includes a long list of woes and unfavorable comparisons in Matthew 23. And the prediction that there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth at the judgment time is repeatedly directed at the religious leaders. These are things that it's not only there, but it's particularly there in Matthew's gospel. Those are the distinctives of the gospel, and essentially, brothers and sisters, that is my summary of an introduction to the gospel of St. Matthew. Thank you. And now we're looking forward to Sunday with Pastor Dave, who will actually go into the book. I have been talking about the book, and on Sunday, starting this Sunday, he will be going into the Gospels. Thank you very much. And I know you have some questions and you have some comments, and I'd love to be able to hear your thoughts. Thank you.